Before I introduce our next speaker joining us live for this conversation on high impact giving, I want to go ahead and provide a little bit of context on Givewell, which is a research and funding organization that is directing significant funding, increasingly so, to cost-effective programs in global health and development. So Givewell is perhaps the most influential source of information to guide the grant making of effective altruists, which includes many emerging donors in Silicon Valley. That includes billionaire couple Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna, who have a net worth of over $20 billion and have looked to Givewell as a vehicle for their efforts to give their money away. Givewell has directed more than $1 billion to charities since its inception, and the organization plans to direct $1 billion each year by 2025. So they are on a very fast growth trajectory. And with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Neil Buddy Shah, Managing Director of Givewell, to discuss the evolution of the organization as well as its future plans. Buddy was previously the CEO and co-founder of ID Insight, which helps governments, NGOs, and foundations maximize their social impact using data and evidence. Buddy, thanks so much for joining us here at Prescription for Progress.
Yeah, excited to be here, Catherine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So I have a few questions of my own, of course, but I also want to urge our audience to post questions in the chat, and we'll get to what we can. I believe some of Buddy's colleagues at Givewell are also going to be active in the chat in case you'd like to connect. But Buddy, first, before we dive into Givewell and its evolution so far and where you're headed from here, I mentioned in introducing you that you are now leading Givewell, and previously you led ID Insight, two very interesting organizations in global health and development. So earlier this month, Devex released a list of 22 global development organizations to watch in 2022. You've been at the helm of two of them, ID Insight and now Givewell. And I wonder if you can help us understand what connects the dots between these two organizations. What drew you to each of those roles, and what do those two organizations bring to the sector?
Yeah, absolutely, Catherine. I think the common thread between both ID Insight and Givewell, and frankly, a whole host of other actors in the space now, is this basic realization that there are hundreds of billions of dollars spent every year trying to improve the lives of people living in the lowest income communities in the world, and that money could be much more effective in improving those lives if it's based and informed on solid data and evidence about what works and what doesn't. And so ID Insight obviously focuses on a particular aspect of that problem, essentially generating new data and evidence about the effectiveness of programs in order to inform the practical decisions of policymakers, of foundations, and of implementing organizations like NGOs and social enterprises. And Givewell kind of takes data and evidence that has been generated by organizations like ID Insight, by academic researchers, and then undergoes its own really deep and extensive research process in order to arrive at estimates of what are the most cost-effective ways to either save lives or improve lives, and then directs funding to them. And so, I think of Givewell and ID Insight as part of the same ecosystem and pushing in the same direction of, essentially we can do much more good in the world if our thinking is driven by reason and empiricism about, what works and what doesn't and why.
That's really helpful to understand the connection. And there's also been collaboration between the two organizations over time, which has been an interesting space to watch. I want to dive into this evolution that I sort of previewed. So you joined Givewell a year and a half ago. And, when I first started with Devex back in 2015, Givewell had its place in the sector, but the influence of Givewell has really grown. And I think traditionally people thought of Givewell as basically a list of recommended charities. And now it's a really significant philanthropic funder, as I mentioned. So can you just kind of take us through that journey that predated your joining the organization, and then also in this past year and a half?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the founding motivation behind Givewell was when two of my colleagues, Ellie Hassenfeld and Holden Karnofsky, were, young folks working at a hedge fund, had more money than they really had a desire to spend, and started to look at what are the best ways we can donate money to improve lives. And that process of really trying to identify where are the places where our philanthropic dollars are going to go as far as possible in either saving lives or improving incomes or improving welfare of people, essentially led to the creation of Givewell. And so I think that founding story is reflected in the first several years of Givewell, which is essentially, an open website with really deep research on a whole host of different programs, culminating in a list of recommended charities that anyone could use, go online and direct donations to. And so that was kind of like the original GiveWell 1.0, which in many ways was an open source platform for listing out really vetted, deeply vetted organizations, and then individual retail donors could donate money to those organizations. Now, I think as GiveWell has evolved, one of the things is that it's in practice less of a list of recommended charities, though certainly we still publish all of our research. We list out our top investments or charities, and there are still 50,000 plus donors that give money into GiveWell. But the big shift is essentially that more and more of our money is essentially given into the GiveWell Maximum Impact Fund and then directed or granted out at our discretion. And so, and in addition to that, our money moved has increased tremendously. And so in 2019, we directed around $150 million in grants. In 2020, that number was around $250 million. And last year, it was around $450 to $500 million. And looking forward, we anticipate making grants every year of over $700 million and, eventually, hopefully over $1 billion a year. And so I think the big change in GiveWell's evolution is that a lot of our money moved is essentially us following our process, still publishing everything that we're doing, but then directing the funding ourselves versus kind of retail donors choosing what they want to give to. And then the second big material change since founding was just the amounts of money that we're moving now. And so in many ways, we operate as a large philanthropic funder now, but still with the core values of intense truth seeking about what are the most cost effective ways to give and an extremely high degree of transparency about the full reasoning behind any of our grants or decisions.
Thank you. And a follow-up on that transparency. So, even as you said, GiveWell has taken this big shift where more money is given to this maximum impact fund and more money is granted at your discretion. There's transparency that's central to your communications around all this, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't come without controversy. And last year, GiveWell was very transparent about how it held back 110 million in giving, saying it couldn't find enough grant opportunities that clear its high bar. And that generated a lot of buzz. You can find our Devex coverage on that. But I wonder if you can expand on that decision and how it connects with this GiveWell evolution you described.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's helpful to step back for a second and think about, what is the mission of GiveWell? And as with many others, our goal really is to, again, save or improve the most lives possible per dollar that we spend. And in order to do that, we're really looking at three criteria. We're looking for programs that have evidence that they're effective. Second, are extremely cost effective, which I think is really important and separate from just the evidence of effectiveness. And on the health side, that generally means programs or organizations that can save the life of someone in a true counterfactual sense for around $3,000 to $6,000 per life saved. And then lastly, can absorb a lot of money. And so as we were thinking last year about the available opportunities that we had that were deeply researched and cost effective that we could grant to, we found around $450 million or so worth of opportunities that met our criteria. And the benchmark that we use to judge all of our investments is against unconditional cash transfers of Give Directly's cash transfer program in Kenya. And essentially, we look for programs that within our criterion framework are at least 5 times as cost effective as cash transfers. And so last year, essentially, we had exhausted all of those opportunities that met this high bar of being 5 times as cost effective as cash transfers. And so we faced a decision. Should we spend the $100 million on just giving the cash away, or did we think we had actual discrete opportunities in our pipeline that would be coming out in the next year or two that we thought were substantially more cost effective? And so we returned to kind of our core principle of what's the impact maximizing thing to do. And for our resources, that meant to hold the money this year because we thought we'd have opportunities in the next 2 years that were multiple times as cost effective as our default option, which was to donate that to give directly. And so there's a lot of discrete things in the pipeline that look very cost effective and we're quite excited about. And that was the core reason why we decided to hold back that $100 million, because we thought that we'd be able to do more good by spending it on more cost effective opportunities in the years to come.
And just a quick follow up to that point before we look ahead at what's next. Though this does relate to looking ahead, you mentioned you're optimistic about what's coming down the pipeline. Can you give us a bit of a preview?
Yeah, so I think our research process is to kind of look both at what are the big drivers of death or ill health, as well as what are the big opportunities to improve incomes, and then which solutions within those seem tractable and can absorb a lot of money. And so I think we're seeing a lot of promise in the neonatal and maternal health space, in conditional cash transfers to incentivize immunizations, where we've already made tens of millions of dollars worth of grants, and in a whole host of water treatment programs to prevent diarrheal disease and deaths. And so those are just some of them. And on the income improving side, I think we're starting to look into programs like targeting the ultra poor, the graduation model, and others that seem like they could be promising, but still very early stages of investigation. And so I think between all of those, we feel as though in the next 2 years, we should be able to identify a lot of opportunities that are really cost effective at saving lives or improving incomes.
Now, looking ahead, I know that being in a position of having this much money to give away actually creates some challenges. You mentioned as we were getting ready for this call that one of the biggest constraints for Givewell is finding those evidence-backed, cost-effective organizations that can absorb such large amounts of money. And yet, I think Givewell wants to increase its influence even further and direct even larger flows of capital toward interventions that meet this high bar. So can you talk about plans for Givewell to further increase its influence moving forward?
Yeah, right now, I think the biggest constraint that we have and the thing that we'd want most is for more implementing organizations and researchers to really understand our criteria so that they're better equipped to partner with us, and so that we're better able to get great ideas from the brilliant people working on these really challenging problems. And so I just encourage folks to reach out, to look at our website, and to really dig into our criteria, because the cost effectiveness models that we use look very hard at a bunch of kind of obscure things that ultimately can make a difference to how much you can improve people's lives. And so the biggest ask that I'd have is for us to reach out more to the community and to learn more about what people are working on, but also for folks to better understand Givewell's criteria so that we can identify more organizations running programs that are cost effective and can absorb large amounts of money, since that's our number one priority right now.
Thank you, buddy. Well, it's always great to catch up with you. Givewell is constantly evolving and changing, so it's good to touch base periodically. I know you've joined us here at Prescription for Progress before. Thanks for joining us again. And for any questions we didn't get to in the audience chat, please feel free to interact with Givewell colleagues who are joining the chat. Buddy, thanks again. And for our audience, please stay tuned for further Devex coverage of Givewell.